of incremental measures to achieve the NATO 5% of GDP defense pledge.
Okay, there we go.
And the government's comprehensive expenditure review. We will incorporate these and other measures when the government provides sufficiently detailed information. I'm now going to briefly summarize our findings. On economic growth, we project growth in the Canadian economy to be modest this year and next, with real GDP growth averaging only 1.2%. This outlook is shaped by factors such as increased trade uncertainty and the implementation of tariffs, as well as slowing population growth. On inflation, we project inflation to remain near the Bank of Canada's 2% target and assume that the Bank of Canada will maintain its policy rate at 2.5% before returning it to its neutral level of 2.75% late next year. On the fiscal outlook, we project the budgetary deficit will be $68.5 billion, that's billion with a B, this fiscal year, which is 2.2% of GDP. Looking forward, we project the deficit will decline slightly, but remain close to $60 billion through the medium term. On federal debt, we project the federal debt to GDP ratio will be 42.5% of GDP this year, rising over the medium term and remaining well above its pre-pandemic level. Mr. Chair, in the spirit of providing the clearest and most direct information to this committee, I'm proposing to try a slightly different approach today. With me at the table are the lead analysts and directors who were responsible for preparing this outlook. Diara, who is in charge of our economic forecast, Christina, who is in charge of our budgetary and fiscal outlook, and Tim, who looks like a security guard but is actually responsible for our work on tariffs. They are the experts who built the models and performed the analysis that underpins the report you have before you. Je suis bien sûr prêt à répondre à toutes vos questions.
While I am, of course, prepared to answer any and all of your questions, I believe the committee's work will benefit from the opportunity to hear from them.
Turn this up
With your permission, I have asked my colleagues to respond directly to your questions regarding the economy, tariffs, and fiscal outlook. Our office remains steadfastly committed to its core mandate, providing independent, non-partisan analysis of the nation's finances and the economy. Thank you for your time. We are now happy to answer your questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Jacques. We'll start with Mrs. Block for 6 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Chair, and thank you to you, Mr. Jacques, and your colleagues for joining us here again today. It's good to see you in just one short week since your previous appearance. I do appreciate the report that you tabled and look forward to the answers that you and your team are going to provide today. In Figure 1 of your report, you no longer predict the debt to GDP ratio improving. In fact, it would appear that what was once a fiscal anchor has now been abandoned by this Prime Minister and his government, as your report indicates the debt to GDP increasing to a clearly alarming rate of 42.5%. So my questions are these. Is this sustainable? At what point does it hit a critical point? And should Canadians be concerned?
Can I jump in?
Yes.
Still working out the kinks. With respect to, thank you for your question. To answer, I think, the most important part of the question first, I think everybody should be concerned. My jokes aside, it's a really serious day, right? This is the first time in 30 years that we've tabled an economic and fiscal outlook where the fiscal anchor of the general and probably most important fiscal anchor for any government is a declining or at least stable debt to GDP ratio. And this is the first time in 30 years that I've seen one in which that ratio is going up over time. So that's definitely a cause for concern. Certainly on our end, we're hoping and certainly expecting the government, as part of Budget 2025, to clearly indicate what the government plans to do to address this and potentially address this problem, because it's certainly not sustainable.
Thank you. So in response to your last statement, again, under the current leadership, this government is set to worsen the outlook of our debt. Have you had any indication that it is going to change course?
Well, the government has indicated that they're planning on tabling a budget on November 4th. I think certainly looking at the public statements of the Prime Minister and Minister of Finance, these numbers probably, I don't think they come as a surprise to them. Some of the language that the Prime Minister has certainly used has been very strong with respect to the economic and fiscal challenges that are facing the country right now. And again, we look forward to seeing the government's plan to manage or address the challenges that Canada faces. As the Parliamentary Budget Office, and as we discussed last week, our job is to set the table for parliamentarians, to present numbers to them. So as parliamentarians, you're well prepared to engage in thoughtful and meaningful discussion regarding how this projection hopefully will not come to pass.
Thank you. In your opening statements, you spoke to the fact that this outlook does not include incremental measures to achieve the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or in other words, our commitments to NATO. And I'm wondering if you would be able to comment on what other spending that may have been included in the Liberal platform is not included in your numbers.
Thank you for your question. The last time that I've looked, there's about 20 billion or so in spending that has not yet been included in our outlook from the Liberal platforms, if it does come to pass. So we will see on November 4th what they will announce and what they don't announce, but roughly that is what's not included in our outlook right now.
Thank you. So last week we talked about the government looking to change the rules for accounting and splitting out capital and operating, and how they may choose to define those things. And I can't find a rationale from the government on why they would overturn a long history of accounting practice with the budget. Can you explain why the Liberals are separating the capital and operating budgets? And why can't they demonstrate progress in the economy without making these changes?
I would note that the government up to this point has indicated that they're planning on maintaining the existing presentation of data, so the traditional measures of debt and deficit that you see in the public accounts that everyone is used to, in addition to presenting this new framework of splitting the operating and capital budgets, or like day-to-day spending plus some sort of investment. It's an approach that happens in other jurisdictions. To the best of my knowledge, pretty much every Canadian province has an operating budget, a standard budget, plus an investment budget. As we discussed last week, the City of Toronto does the same thing. To the extent that it can be additive and helps parliamentarians understand that potentially more money needs to be borrowed over the short term in order to make investments to transition to longer-term sustainable economic growth, potentially at a higher level, that it could potentially be useful. Going back to the point
sorry, I have to cut you off there. We're past our time, but perhaps we can get back to it next round. Ms. Suds, please, for 6 minutes, please.
Terrific. Thank you very much, and thank you for being with us here again. It's my understanding today that we have actually two reports that were tabled, although your opening remarks leaned heavily, of course, on the economic and fiscal outlook. I wanted to spend a bit of time as well on the federal infrastructure spending, if I may. First, just to be clear in reading it, the report is reflecting infrastructure across the entire government. not just within the Department of Infrastructure. Is that correct? Yes. Okay, thank you. And so, as I was reading the report, an obvious question to me that I don't think was addressed was just what needs to happen? What can government do in order to make the system better?
Thanks for your question. It's a really good question for which, as interim parliamentary budget officer, I am not particularly well placed to answer it. From a government-wide perspective, something that we do mention in the report, and that definitely jumped out to us, was we've been tracking infrastructure spending across government since 2016. But that was the point where the federal government made a big push to increase the size of spending and also increase the size of infrastructure spending writ large, and also spread it out across various departments. And a recurring theme is it's exceptionally challenging and very difficult to actually pull all the data together. And unfortunately, it continues to be the case. So that's the first thing. If one was looking for an opportunity to actually fix, improve the infrastructure spending across the federal government, simply keeping track of it in a better way would be useful, I think, for everyone. And as well, linking to the previous question with respect to the presentation of operating and capital budgets, infrastructure spending and these transfers that they're payments that go out to other levels of government. It's not traditional capital spending on federal assets. And so conceivably, you'd want to incorporate it as part of your capital budget. But if you're not tracking it, if the government isn't tracking it, it's going to be really hard to actually do that. So that's probably one of the key challenges that the government and the public service is going to face.
Okay, excellent. Thank you for that. I am curious your thoughts as to whether the infrastructure bank is helping to reduce the infrastructure deficit in the country.
I don't think as interim parliamentary budget officer, I don't think I have an opinion on that. We haven't looked at the specific contribution that the infrastructure bank makes to alleviating or reducing the infrastructure deficit across the country. Yeah.
Perhaps a future study, something to dive into, is certainly quite a bit of activity there.
That's not his role.
To your earlier comment about kind of the desperate nature of the infrastructure spend, who should be tracking the infrastructure spend across government if it was to be a centralized
The
authority?
government.
I don't think I have an opinion as interim parliamentary budget officer. I don't think I have an opinion with respect to within the government among the federal departments who's tracking it. Only that there's somebody who's tracking it centrally. There end up being clear definitions, and the information is obviously being fed to the relevant minister and the Department of Finance on a relatively frequent basis, both in terms of planning on the budgeting side, so how much of the budget is going to be split into operating and capital, but also how much money is actually going out the door in a timely way. Because as part of the work we've done on infrastructure in the past, that was another one of the interesting findings, that notwithstanding the budgetary announcements for many new programs, there end up being challenges in actually spending the money as originally anticipated. And of course, in some situations, the money is transferred to other governments, and it's hard to actually, for the federal government to tease out precisely how it was spent.
Thank you. Perhaps one last quick question. Perfect. So our government has been quite clear and been on the record about the desire to leverage more private capital, particularly for things like infrastructure. I again curious that on your viewpoint on this, if you view this positively and the best way that this could happen such that it benefits Canadians.
Looking at the infrastructure deficit across the country, and looking certainly at the government's interest in increasing capital spending at this point writ large, obviously you'd want as many sources of capital as possible, right? As opposed to exclusively relying upon the federal government and its balance sheet to borrow the additional money to make the contemplated investments. In terms of how that would best be done, I think if you look at the balance sheet of the Government of Canada, there are some things that they've already done in the past, like starting with straight borrowing of additional money, making those investments themselves on the assets that they own, borrowing the money, and potentially creating or funding another, like the Canada Infrastructure Bank, another organization that could potentially partner or make investments or provide loans, or potentially providing loan guarantees as well. So there's a suite of options that available to the government. I think the nature of what you do really depends on the nature of the asset that you're looking at. So there are some projects where they're very high risk, they're very large, potentially they're very high risk, and it potentially makes more sense for the government to be, if they want to see the projects done, it makes more sense for the government to be intervening in that situation because the market won't naturally intervene and actually make it happen.
Thank you very much. Ms. Goodrow, please, for 6.
Bien, à 9 heures, Monsieur le Président, quand j'ai reçu
This morning at 9 a.m. when I received the document, I was able to read the whole thing attentively, and that's why I have very specific questions. And I have quite a number. Thank you, Chair. My first question. What is worrying? Is it most worrying? Is it the increase in the debt to GDP ratio or the lack of a specific budget plan?
Pour moi, je pense que
In my view, it's the increase in the debt to GDP ratio. On November 4th, there will be a plan, according to the Government of Canada. But in all honesty, it was clear even before we published our figures that there's a tremendous challenge in Canada, but seeing the figures and the increase in the debt as a percentage of our economy, that was quite stupefying. So now we have a snapshot of how things stand now. The Prime Minister was sold to us as an international banker, but do you believe that he is being sufficiently serious about the economic and budgetary situation? I'm not a psychologist. As an Interim Parliamentary Budget Officer, I'm not well placed to talk about the psychological state of the Prime Minister of Canada. The deficit includes new spending that was in the Liberal Party's campaign. Your projection does not include those. No. What if we were to include them? I'm thinking about the defense budget and the promised increase to NATO's 5%. So what will the debt to GDP ratio be then? I don't think we calculated that, but we might be able to prepare some figures and provide them to the committee within a few days. What I'm seeing is that spending is going up, and the federal budget's trajectory is concerning. If we were to look at an analogy, it's like a family seeing its income go down, but that family isn't adjusting its spending accordingly. Yes, that's a good analogy, I believe. We're waiting to see the budget on November 4th. So if we look at the next decade, if public finances were not restructured, if there was no plan for that, what would the consequences be for Canada? Well, I think we have used the word significant, major in our report. not enviable in the long term, not sustainable in the long term. That's what's shocking. And this is why we are waiting to see with interest what Canada will do to rectify that projection. Well, the IMF talks about 3 very clear budget rules. The first is that a budget should be clear, should be simple, and should not be manipulated by the government. In those 3, what we can call rules, what would Canada's score be, or grade? What grade would you give Canada on that? I couldn't really say because, well, last week the Prime Minister did provide some clarification on some of Canada's financial and budget issues. Last week did show some progress, but things are not yet clear. I'd give it a C at the moment. I'd give it a grade of C. But, you know, it's like for my children. It's a C for now, but there will be chances to bring that grade up in the coming weeks and months.
Or bring it down to an F.
For my next question, I'd like to know what the medium-term consequences on taxpayers might be, given how things stand. I'll come back to this. My time is up. Thank you. See, I'm keeping to my time. 25 seconds. Right. So what would those repercussions be? Clearly, revenue will have to go up. And perhaps at the same time, spending will have to go down. The current numbers aren't sustainable. And I imagine that people at the Department of Finance are well aware of that. So I believe the November 4th budget will show that changes are to come. Thank you. Thank you.
5-minute rounds. As is custom, we've let the first rounds always run a bit longer for a more wholesome answer. But going forward, if everyone could just keep an eye on the clock. Mr. Patzer, 5 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you, everybody, for being here today. I do think it's important to take a look at Table 2 here, and for people back home, as of 2024-25, the public debt charges is $53.6 billion, and that projection is going to increase to in 2030 to $82.4 billion. Is that sustainable?
That's the interest on the debt?
We also see that the debt servicing ratio is increasing over the projection horizon. So every dollar spent on debt is a dollar that is not spent elsewhere. As Mr. Jacques said, that the debt to GDP ratio is something that we look at in terms of sustainability. So that is what we're tracking, and that is what we're very focused on.
Yeah, and I mean, that was one of the hallmark fiscal anchors of the Trudeau government, right? And when it was 30.8, it was never going to go higher than that. That was kind of their commitment, and here we are in the table here. It's 41.7, increasing to 43.7. Again, how alarming is that for the average Canadian, for the taxpayer? Because there is only one taxpayer, right?
I'll hazard a response. It should be very alarming, right? These are, I don't know, I think I used the words in French, and which the translators probably got really well, like stupefying, shocking, right? This is not, like, it's not a funny fiscal outlook. It's a really serious fiscal outlook. And we don't lightly use the word unsustainable, right? Unsustainable means you don't have the option of saying, maybe I'll wait a couple of years, I'll see how things go. It means if you don't change, this is done, right? So it's very serious. And I think, as anyone who's managed a household budget knows, if you sit down at the end of the month and you don't have enough money to pay your bills, and it happens month after month after month, you know that something's going to break.
Kind of along that, you look at the federal debt number in that table number 2, 24-25, it's $1,281 billion, and in 2030 it's up to $1,655 billion. What impact does that have on the Canadian economy and for businesses, for taxpayers, for the people who are supposed to be the ones generating the wealth? But when we see the government is in debt, $1,655 billion in the year 2030, what impact does that have?
Well, currently the economy is, that's definitely a big, I guess, one of the big drivers of what's currently happening in the economy, but there's also heightened uncertainty related to trade policies. But if we look at the federal government debt, maybe Christina will be a bit more better place to elaborate. But I would have to say that something to keep in mind is that a great portion of the federal debt is domestically emitted, so it is Canadian banks receiving profit from that debt, and there are various levels or various participants of the financial markets who are involved in that debt market. So it's not necessarily foreign actors who are holding that debt, but it's just important to keep in mind that some domestic actors are also benefiting from that.
Right. So when we look at what happened with tariffs, for example, the Prime Minister said he's going to collect $20 billion in tariffs. And in your report, it says there's only $8 billion. This morning, CBC wrote an article that the Prime Minister quietly removed even more tariffs than what he initially said. So again, we're over $12 billion. There's a $12 billion shortfall here. And we don't really see a path forward in that situation. What impact is that going to have for Canadians?
In terms of the amounts that the government is collecting from the countermeasures, the government has also announced as many measures as we have assumed that it collected. So as you've mentioned in our report, we've noted that it could collect $8 billion in the 3-year span, but it has also announced a lot of support measures to other industries.
I have to cut you off there because it's past our time. Ms. Rochefort, please, for 5 minutes.
Okay, thank you. And I was delighted to read in your federal infrastructure spending report that you mentioned that the objective of your work is to improve the quality of parliamentary debates and promote greater budgetary transparency and accountability. So I agree as well. So that said, I am concerned that when you appeared before OGGO last week and you answered a number of questions from all parties, that the next day during question period, the only comments that were made came from a single point of view and did not reflect your comments. I remember hearing you speak about rupture with the United States and, that we're facing a different world from an economic perspective. And so how can we therefore guarantee that your comments today will contribute to improving the quality of parliamentary debate, which is the objective? So that's my first question.
It's a really good question. I would say on a lot of there's onus on us as an organization, and there's onus on parliamentarians. I'd say the onus on us as an organization is to ensure today's report, it has about 2,500 words in it, in either official language, is to ensure that the words are very carefully chosen, to ensure that to the greatest extent possible, they can't easily be taken out of context. The other change that we're making in the office, and you see part of it today, being joined by colleagues and the technical experts, is trying to reinforce the technical grounding and the numbers into the presentation to the committee. So trying to take away some of the words and inject some more facts and numbers. The last change that we're making on our side, some parliamentarians may be aware that for the first time ever, we introduced actually a media blackout in the office when the report was released at 9 o'clock this morning. And that was very deliberate because of the invitation from the Government Operations Committee. We wanted to try something very different where we released the report. We had many meetings with parliamentarians to provide briefings and background on the report. And our first on-the-record testimony was here. And the hope was that our words would be going to you first, so parliamentarians would have a very clear sense of what we're saying and how we're presenting the work. In terms of having the next step of having parliamentarians potentially more represent the work in a more balanced way, I don't have a good answer for that. But if you figure it out, let me know, and I'm happy to help you implement it.
Well, I do agree 100% with your comments that words do matter, so thank you for saying that. Second question, I was just wondering, your report on economic and the fiscal outlook, wondering how long it took your office to prepare such a report.
So in terms of duration, the work started about at the end of August. I'd say it usually takes about around midpoint of August till around now. We have a team in place. It's a tremendous amount of work, but we have a really great team in place who have years of experience at this point, so we can turn things around relatively quickly.
Thank you for that. And just wondering, to do justice to your report, and as my colleague MP Gaudreau mentioned, do you think it's fair that we as parliamentarians only receive a few hours to review such a comprehensive report? Does it do justice to your work?
No, that's why you asked him about it.
It's not for me to judge whether it does justice to our work, because we're doing work for parliamentarians. I'd actually, and I'm not supposed to do this, but I'll do it anyway. I'm going to turn the question back on parliamentarians to say, is there a better way for us to present the work to you? And is there a better way to present the work to you so you can make it more useful? So today we tried something new with having the technical experts here. We tried the media blackout with an idea that we can kind of cut through the noise and present the results directly to parliamentarians, our clients. If there are other suggestions that you have that would make it more useful for you, we're all ears. Our office was created to support parliamentarians, right? So, I don't know, money comes in from across the country, comes to Ottawa, and Parliament cuts a check to create a parliamentary budget office. So, I don't know, like the people who might, if you pay somebody to cut your lawn and they're doing a bad job, you either fire them and find somebody else, or you give them additional direction regarding how they can do it better. Hopefully you don't fire us, but hopefully you provide us with additional direction.
Well, thank you.
That's our time, thanks. Ms. Gaudreau, please, for 2.5 minutes, please.
Je vais revenir, Monsieur le Président.
Chair, I'll come back to the committee's last meeting, at which we talked about uncertainty, lack of transparency. It was the beginnings of a concern about rating agencies. I talked about the IMF and its 3 rules. So what do you think it's going to be like in 10 years? Should we be concerned? And how is the government managing its budgetary policy message? I think the answer to that question is already there in your own words. It's transparency. We advocate for more transparency. That's what we want to see, more transparency about the budget, about the financial plan, about the government's economic plan. That's the first stage, or the first step, I should say, in reducing uncertainty. For the rating agencies and for all Canadians. there's always some difficulty when there are shocking news, but when news are shocking, having a plan is one way of assuaging concerns. Thank you. In a democracy, which is what we are, there are a number of pillars. The first is transparency, as we've just said. One concern of mine is that the government is debating Canadian public policy on the basis of U.S. policy and is basically leaving aside sound management because the end justifies the means. What's your view on that? Because I'm very concerned about it. I think that is a valid point. And I hope people working in the Department of Finance are working hard to ensure that with the coming changes, everyone who might be affected by these major changes will be supported.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. It's a pleasure to be at the mighty OGGO. Make sure we get that on the record for Hansard. Mr. Jacques and your team, thank you for showing up. Appreciate your work. I would say, with it being well over a year since we've had a budget, it's nice to have some picture as parliamentarians for, as you say, setting the table for what's to come. I hope I want to make sure I understand some of the assumptions that you've made, just so that I understand your very sobering testimony, and I thank you for, mentioning kind of how serious of a moment we're in fiscally. If I look at Appendix A in your detailed economic outlook, you're not forecasting a recession, is that correct? Like you have unemployment, it's up in 2025, but it's back down afterwards in 26 onwards, and you have real GDP growth. It's small, but it's positive 1.2, 1.3 ongoing. So you're not projecting a recession, is that correct?
No,
okay.
We're not projecting a recession, just very moderate growth.
So our current debt service costs, or even just the amount of debt we're taking on each year, is increasing at an alarming rate without any economic recession or headwinds. Not to say we don't have economic challenges, but my point is your assumptions are that the economy actually is growing from here on out, that unemployment is falling, and we're still seeing some fairly serious increases in annual debt service costs, and substantially, as my colleague has just pointed out, up to about $80 billion a year. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Right. So, and I'm not challenging your assumptions, but obviously there are other pathways the economy can take. Some people are saying, well, unemployment actually may continue to increase. Growth might actually be a lot slower than we project. If unemployment goes up further or growth is not as high as you project, what will happen to the deficit and then the subsequent debt service costs?
If the economic path is worse than projected or worse than we anticipate, then the deficit figures will deteriorate.
Right.
I would, and something I think I mentioned to the committee last week, I would say on our end we're feeling pretty good about where things stand in the short term. So where we are now and going out over the next 12 to 18 months. The big question, and it's a policy question, which isn't in our bailiwick, but certainly is in the bailiwick of parliamentarians, is where do we end up in years 3, 4, and 5? Given the rupture that the Prime Minister has referred to, given the Prime Minister's reference to, quote, there's no going back, how do we get to those areas of growth? How do we get, what are the policies that are going to be in place to ensure that the Canadian economy can return to its full potential growth?
Right.
Yeah.
I guess what I'm highlighting, or what I'm glad you're kind of confirming, is we might not be in the worst economic environment yet. And what we're seeing actually with the levels of spending is we're increasing the risk to the fiscal framework of the country before we're in potentially much more serious economic challenges. Like if we're going to spend almost 14 cents of every dollar on interest on the debt without a recession in the next couple of years, what could that be if there is a recession? Could be 15, could be 18, could be, any number. Would you view that as a risk to the framework?
I would view it as, and going back to quote, no one ever got laughed out of the room by quoting the governor of the Bank of Canada. It's positive growth, but it's not going to feel good for most Canadians across the country. And yeah, in a situation, it definitely gives one pause where the economic numbers are positive and the fiscal numbers are negative and substantially negative.
And we're borrowing record amounts of debt in the markets today,
Yeah.
Correct?
That's our time. I'm
Pardon
sorry.
Pardon me, Chair. Thank you for your indulgence.
Mr. Gasparo, please go ahead.
Thank you. And welcome back to the mighty OGGO. That's for you, Chair. Last time you were here last week, we focused on infrastructure. So it's only appropriate we pivot back to fiscal matters. So looking at our current position, we can't look at it in a vacuum. It has to be viewed, I would say, on a comparative basis. So Canada still maintains its AAA credit rating, and its current debt to GDP ratio is, I think, 2.2%. How does that compare to some of our G7 colleagues?
Why? I can have one.
No.
To Canada relative to other countries is in a more favorable, if you look at the numbers, in a more favorable situation immediately. I would say, like for myself, the analogy is, I don't know, you're 200 pounds overweight and you have 50% body fat, and everybody else in your group, in your weight loss group, has 75% body fat and is like 400 pounds overweight and can't get out of bed. So, yeah, like we're in a more advantageous position, and in many ways, that's the opportunity where we can hopefully we have space and time where we can move quickly to rectify the situation.
So is that a reflection of the current global economic environment?
Yeah, very much so. The member referred to the work of the International Monetary Fund, and a lot of what the International Monetary Fund has been publishing recently on the fiscal side is advice to all countries to reduce deficits, reduce debt, and batten down the hatches and prepare yourself to make some tough decisions. So it certainly isn't advice to Canada. All other countries, and as I mentioned last week, there are some countries looking at France and looking at the UK where their financial markets are certainly rockier than ours right now, certainly in terms of debt issuance. So relatively speaking, we're in a more favorable position. It, at the same time, doesn't obviate the fact that the path that we're on right now isn't sustainable. And we might have more time than those other countries, but we're going to end up in a very similar place without changes.
Right. How much time do I have, Chair? I have another 2.5 minutes? Oh, okay, great.
2 hours, 2 minutes, and 10 seconds.
Okay, great. So another question, obviously. You project, so we're on a good fiscal path, or we're on a better fiscal path than some of our G7 colleagues, and you project our deficit staying under 2% of GDP and debt holding near the low 40% range. Would you agree that these kinds of thresholds are really, in practice, fiscal anchors that signal some discipline.
I would go back to one of the comments I made at the outset that, like, the most important word in the release this morning was unsustainable. We like it. I don't know. We didn't. We didn't choose it carelessly. I've been in the office for 17 years. I was working in the federal government, putting together budgets for 10 years prior to that. You got to be like, you choose these words with prudence and care. And certainly we don't want to be alarmist. And at the same time, like the current path we're on in terms of federal debt as a share of the economy is unsustainable.
Yep, thank you. Coming back to our credit rating. Obviously, it's a fairly internationally recognized standard in terms of how sustainable our fiscal position is. How does that compare to some of our G7 colleagues?
We, relatively speaking, again, similar to the fiscal metrics, we end up being further ahead or closer to the top of the group.
Thank you.
Great. Before we go to Mr. Gill, just to follow up on Mr. Gasparo's comment, I do get a royalty every time someone calls it the Mighty OGGO, so please continue with that. Go ahead, Mr. Gill.
Mighty OGGO, sir. Thanks for being here, everybody. If trade tensions and tariffs continue, how much worse could things get for Canadian businesses, jobs, and prices? And a two-part question. What would happen to our economy if the CUSMA trade deal was rescinded or negotiated or renegotiated in a way that hurts us?
Yeah, I can take that. So we didn't do a specific scenario, like a downside scenario regarding the renegotiation of CUSMA. But one thing that's important to point out is that our baseline assumption regarding tariffs is that things will improve from current levels with respect to trading conditions with the United States, although we do expect that they will remain less favorable than in the past, but things will improve. So if things don't improve, then I think that would be a direct negative impact on our economic outlook.
Thanks. On what basis are you painting that picture to say it'll possibly improve? It can possibly go down as well.
Our assumption is based on, I think, the stated policy intentions and what we've observed over the past 3 months, and it is a very volatile environment that changes day by day, and some of these assumptions regarding tariffs and sectors are moving targets, but at least from it appears from Canada's perspective, the intention is not to have these countermeasures in place permanently or as a part of fiscal policy. We are seeing from the United States deals are being struck depending on, I guess, various levels of favorability depending on which country. But ultimately, as an office, we do have to make a baseline projection, and we do a point estimate for our economic and fiscal outlook, and that does require an assumption that we're constantly updating. This one we did think was reasonable, particularly in the context of CUSMA being potentially up for negotiation next year.
Okay. Our debt servicing at currently, I think, I saw the figure, it's $55 billion for the whole year, so it's $1 billion a week roughly. Projected to go up to, I think, $82 billion by 2029-30. At what point would the interest costs start forcing cuts to healthcare, education, and other services?
That's not a PBO decision.
Because the growth rate is not going to be the same as the debt ratio is going, or are we expecting the GST revenues to be matching that growth?
Yeah, I'd say sorry, excuse me. I'd say in terms of the increase in the debt charge expenses, yet more broadly, and as I mentioned earlier, the path we're currently on isn't sustainable, and the government will need to make choices to either increase revenues or cut spending in order to stop arrest this unsustainable path that we're on. I I don't know, we don't put together the budget. We only analyze the budget and put together forecasts. So I don't know precisely what's on the table at this point beyond what the government's already announced publicly.
So the increase in revenue is possibly through taxes then? Increase in taxes?
Generically. So in a situation where you need to reduce your budget deficit, you need to be able to bring in on a net basis more revenue. So you reduce your deficit in order to return to a fiscally sustainable path. You need to either increase your revenue, so more cash coming in, or decrease the amount of money that you're spending, or a combination of both.
How much more time do I have, sir? 1 minute. Okay. In your previous appearance before this committee, you said that you weren't aware if the government had any fiscal anchors. In your report, you outlined that the Liberals have abandoned their 2 previous fiscal anchors, namely that they will no longer have a declined debt-to-GDP ratio, and their budgetary deficits will exceed 1% of GDP. What impact will this have on future government spending if they continue to operate without fiscal anchors?
With last week, the Prime Minister was asked in question period to clarify the fiscal anchors. He did provide some clarification indicating that there's going to be a greater shift to investment, declining level of debt overall. So there does provide some clarity that there are fiscal anchors. I believe the Minister of Finance also provided guidance regarding a target regarding a deficit, a budgetary deficit as a share of GDP anchor. That said, it certainly isn't comprehensive at this point with respect to what they are. It's always helpful to have fiscal anchors, right? It's always useful. It's the reason why hopefully you don't need guardrails while you're driving down the highway.
Got to cut you off there, I'm afraid. We're going to go now to Ms. Sadu, please, for 5 minutes. I
can take her.
Oh.
I'm not sure she's...
Okay, go ahead then,
I'm up.
please. Thank you.
Absolutely, thank you.
Restart the clock, go ahead.
Awesome, thank you. And this is 5 minutes, correct? Yeah. Okay, thank you, and great to have a chance to ask some more questions. Despite some of the comments that I've heard over this first hour in the meeting, I think it's very fair to say that Canada is experiencing some historic challenges right now. Of course, given everything that has been happening in this trade war. And so undoubtedly that has, ramifications, massive ramifications, as we look at the report and at our economy. And, as I reflect on this, I struggle to imagine an alternative in which we were not making the investments that we are making in Canadians right now. Acknowledging, of course, that does, of course, cost, and there is a cost to that reflected in the projected deficit. But I would challenge, and I guess I would question what the alternative is at this moment in time when we know that Canadians need us.
Yeah, I don't know that as Interim Parliamentary Budget Officer, I'm well placed to comment on alternative economic or fiscal policy.
And it's that's a fair answer. And I think as members of Parliament, as individuals representing our respective communities, being close to the ground, understanding the challenges that our communities face is reflected in the measures and the policies that we've been putting forward to ensure that we are investing where needed to support Canadians through what we know will continue to be challenging times through this trade war as our economy rebounds. So all that to say, I appreciate it is a tough question, but from this vantage point, certainly important to just, raise the flag that as elected officials, we certainly have a different vantage point than the Parliamentary Budget Office certainly would. Moving on from that, I did want to just ask, of course, in the report, you pointed towards weaker trade. The global uncertainty, of course, was referenced. And there are key drivers in the outlook that was put forward. So can you expand on how much Canada's fiscal picture is being shaped by those two things, the weaker trade and the global uncertainty?
I think a good starting point would be to look at what's happening to nominal GDP, which is, as we call it, the largest proxy for the tax base. And because of those headwinds, trade policies, and other challenges as well, such as demographics, we've revised our outlook for nominal GDP by approximately 13 billion every year during our outlook. And that definitely contributes to affecting the fiscal position. But as Christina would say, there are other items or measures that have also been included in there.
Okay, excellent. Thank you very much. Secondly, so your baseline captures existing measures announced up until, I believe, it was September 5th, but it doesn't weigh in on the full impact of investments in housing, investments in infrastructure or skills. Would you agree that these measures would strengthen growth over time?
On those specific investments, we do have a view as to what the baseline looks in terms of government investment in general. Unfortunately, because we don't have enough details as to how big or how these investments will be delivered, we have not fully incorporated them in our outlook. But we do know, depending on the delivery mechanism, an investment might have more or less different impact on the economy. For example, business investment has a different multiplier than transfers to households, for example. So it just depends on how the delivery is being done.
Yes, excellent. Just to wrap up, I appreciate those comments and look forward to seeing the impact of these very strategic investments that our government has been making to the betterment of the country and the economy. Thank you.
Thanks. Ms. Gaudreau, please, back to you for 2.5.
Rapidement, Monsieur le Président.
Quickly, Chair. I'm neither an economist nor an accountant. But if we want income and expenditure to balance, well, personally, in my view, if I look at what's going on here, I would have been bankrupt a long time ago. So how can the government, well, explain this. How can the government base its taxes and reduce the government's tax base? What am I failing to understand here? We are not really well placed to explain the Canadian government's policy decisions. I'm the Interim Parliamentary Budget Officer. I don't comment on policy. But I can ask you whether this is responsible. With reduction in tax revenue and increased spending, that will increase the deficit and exacerbate the problem that the Government of Canada needs to rectify. There's another issue here. We see that there'll be a reduction in the size of the public service. That's been promised for some time now. But that actually is associated with a 20% increase in the country because there'll be a 5% increase in defense spending, or spending will go up to 5% of GDP. Well, there'll be more detail on November 4th. My last question. There should be models. Chair, we were hearing about models in the United Kingdom. I know there's some in Quebec. There are provinces and other jurisdictions that are providing transparent breakdowns. Should the Government of Canada not adopt that approach to letting figures speak? That is a good question. I believe the government and the public service is familiar with what other jurisdictions do provinces and other countries. I believe they are selecting their approach with an operational and investment structure or framework. And I think that should be done fairly quickly, but let's wait for November 4th.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just wanted to pick up where we left off when the chair so abruptly cut me off last time. We're issuing a record amount of debt this year, as I understand. The last debt management strategy came out early in the summer. I think about $620 billion has to be issued this year. Is that your understanding as well? Okay. If the government is saying we will spend less and invest more, in theory, these investments will have a return, of course, because investments do have returns. But they continue to borrow short-term debt instruments. How does that, usually you try to match your assets and liabilities, but if you continue to borrow on the short end of the curve, as they say, but making long-term investments, does that not increase the risk to taxpayers that as interest rates change, taxpayers are, and the government's far more exposed to these sensitivity in interest rates such that, our debt service costs could actually increase much more quickly if rates were to go up for any reason? I'll note the rates were dropped recently, but the 5-year yield actually increased after the Bank of Canada increased its rates. Is that your understanding as well? We should be looking at the matching of assets and liabilities?
I think duration matching is a pretty fundamental principle of borrowing and investment to make sure that you're not exposed to fluctuations in the financial market, and you need to come up with cash when in fact you can't because the money's tied up in longer term assets.
Right. Or it's an admission that actually what you're doing is just borrowing to do the operations of government. You don't have to answer that. I'll just leave that there. I read a report earlier this year from the IMF that referenced for every dollar that was spent on interest on the debt, there was a somewhat reduction in spending on social services. Are you aware of that report that came out in the spring, I think? Is that a report that you're familiar with?
Yeah, I'm the report, actually, I think I read the report. I forget it was several months ago, and I read a lot. I forget the precise numbers, but I am familiar with it. But the underlying principle associated with a lot of the basic macroeconomic models is a dollar that the higher your debt and the greater your debt interest costs, it ends up eating up spending in other areas, whether it be social programming or investment or so what have you.
Right. So when you say, when you use the word unsustainable, is that also what you're getting at? That the level of debt that we have and the burden of the service costs of that debt is unsustainable such that a consequence would be a reduction in social service spending?
A reduction in spending. Again, we don't do policy.
Sure.
We do budgeting, and from a basic budgeting perspective, you have spending and you got revenues, and in a situation where you have a large deficit, and effectively your debt levels are growing at an unsustainable rate, you got to either increase your revenues or you got to decrease your spending.
Right. And so when there were questions asked about increasing debt and deficits 5 and 6 years ago, or saying, after the new administration took over and said they were running some small deficits, debt service costs were about, I think, 7 or 8 cents on the dollar. You're now projecting that goes to 14 cents on the dollar. Some people were laughed out of the room for asking questions about why we should be concerned about this, but here we are. And again, that's before we have any serious economic downturns or even a recession. So would you say that spending is at risk as debt service costs continue to increase? Is that a fair?
That would be conventional macroeconomic policy as practiced by the world.
So are we close to where we were in the mid-90s? Maybe, are we closer to where we were in the mid-90s than we were 10 years ago?
The numbers in the mid-90s were far more alarming. This is with an increase, now with the federal debt to GDP ratio forecast to increase. If we don't change things, we're going to end up there again. Thankfully.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Ms. Rossworth, please, for 5.
Now, thank you. I'd just like to go back to a previous report that you had published on Canada's Infrastructure Bank. In fact, in that report, you had highlighted the fact that regarding Canada's infrastructure deficit, you had said it's substantial, and I think you had a range, but it went up to $1 trillion was the amount. And I guess that is overall in our country. I mean, there's organizations, even at a municipal level, the Association of Municipalities of Ontario, they could talk about the infrastructure gap. And even yesterday in Alberta, the Association of Municipalities of Alberta talked about, being substantially underfunded when it comes to infrastructure. And so my question to you is, how can the federal government, in terms of transfer payments, how can the federal government better collaborate with provinces and municipalities to optimize, I guess, every dollar that is spent?
Going back to, again, when we start 2016, when we started to do work in this area, the need for better collaboration with provincial governments and large municipalities across the country was something that we did note and we did highlight. And in particular, some of the feedback I recall receiving from large municipalities across the country was, it's great that the Government of Canada has cut us a check, and there's already a 10-year capital plan in place, the contractors are lined up, and there isn't a plan to pay people to work between 10 o'clock at night and 6 o'clock in the morning because you have to pay them double time. So thank you for the money, and we'll just add it on to year 11 at this point. I think that working with the existing plans of municipalities and also provinces who are best placed to actually identify what are the most immediate priorities as opposed to exclusively making those decisions in Ottawa. I think that was one of the key findings that we had identified previously. The other one, and again, is really with respect to the construction industry and focused around the trades, because there's a bottleneck, right? So there's a lot of focus on infrastructure. There's a lot of focus on housing. So we do have a housing crisis. And the need to actually, there's only so much capacity to go around to actually build at this point. So whether it's on infrastructure or whether it's on the housing file, trying to take a coordinated approach across all levels of government with limited resources available, I think it certainly makes sense.
Do you feel there's room for reducing infrastructure spending at a municipal level?
Oh, I would not be well placed to comment on that. I'm sorry. Yeah.
I noticed that the Canadian Infrastructure Bank is included in the list of departments that account for most of the federal infrastructure spending. I was just wondering if you could describe the composition of transfers to the Canadian Infrastructure Bank. Are these committed funds, or are they basically? So, what is the status of those funds at this when we see them in the report?
The majority of the funding for the Canada Infrastructure Bank is committed funding. So it's notionally earmarked for something, whether it's in the early stages of negotiation or closer to actually a final project at this point. I think one of the findings that we made in the past with respect to the Canada Infrastructure Bank and other infrastructure projects is there can be a lot of uncertainty between the initial announcement and something kind of worked out at a high level, and actually shovels in the ground and getting the work done. But I don't know. I'm not an expert. I've never worked for a municipality on infrastructure projects. I think that's normal.
Do you see the opportunity for more private capital aligned with those projects? I think you had referred to that in your study.
Yeah, I think there's far more. Like when you look at the public capital versus the pools of private capital is much larger. So, and especially looking at the draw right now on the in the policy area of defense, which is probably not going to be funded, hopefully not funded by private capital, you're going to need to have the private sector come in and provide that type of support. If for no other reason, it will keep the borrowing costs or the investment costs relatively lower for the government.
Thank you.
We'll now go to Ms. Scabina for 5 minutes. Welcome to OGGO. Go ahead.
Thank you. In your report, you lowered your economic growth assumptions for this year and next year. Could you speak to what degree does this weaker growth amplify the risk of structural deficits and large deficits that we're seeing right now?
Thank you for your question. So I guess the area where it has the biggest impact is nominal GDP, which is used as an approximation for the tax base of the federal government. And we've revised our outlook for nominal GDP by approximately 13 billion annually between 2025 and 2030, and that's the main impact.
And in the report, we see about $115 billion in new spending. But considering that we have we have weak growth, could you speak to how many of those expenditures could be deferrable to a time where we have a stronger economy?
I think so it's, I'm not going to pass judgment on what could be or should be deferred. I would, however, say that when you look at the composition, so 115 billion over about 5 years, about a third of that ends up being defense spending, so additional defense spending on the part of the government. Another substantial chunk is the decline in revenues associated with the reduction in the lowest personal income tax rate from 15 down to 14, and the elimination of the digital services tax. So, could it be deferred? Could those things be deferred at this point? It ends up being very much a policy question of what are the priorities of parliamentarians.
So can you speak to then on whether you see the absence of meaningful expenditure discipline?
It's hard for us. So we published many reports over the past 10 years with respect to the government's efforts around spending restraint and spending review activities. I think, like, up to this point, the results, I would characterize them as best as being uneven. So there's one, in particular, there is one expenditure review activity where the government took credit for underspending for pandemic benefits and declared victory around spending restraint and spending cuts. That said, we're in a new era. The announcements in the official language from the Government of Canada and in the House of Commons is certainly different with respect to the comprehensive expenditure review. And I guess we're going to find out on November 4th.
So you've expressed your doubts on whether the government still has credible fiscal anchors. In your view, what would you count today as a credible fiscal anchor for Canada, and how far is the government from meeting it?
I think the most important fiscal anchor, which the Prime Minister I think indirectly touched on in question period last week, is the debt to GDP ratio. So simply the amount of money that's coming into the federal government and our ability to sustain debt levels. And right now, based upon the status quo forecast and the announcements made to date, with plans, we're not on track. The government will not be on track to actually achieve that fiscal anchor. That said, all of us are still waiting for the government to come up with a plan to, well, one, to officially announce their fiscal anchors, as opposed to providing an overview in QP, and also a plan to ensure that they actually are, how they're going to actually respect those fiscal anchors.
And what do you think are the consequences of Canada not having credible anchors in terms of investor confidence, borrowing costs, credit ratings, et cetera?
The reason why somebody has fiscal anchors is it increases the certainty and the clarity that you're more likely to achieve your objectives, and you're more likely to be able to manage your finances and your budget in an effective way. And the absence of that obviously increases uncertainty. So the lack of transparency in that front results in a situation where, I don't know, you can imagine if you're going into a bank, you want to start a small business, and you're asking them for a couple of $100,000, and they say, well, where's your plan? And you're like, oh, I don't have a plan, but I have a really good idea. Well, do you have any
Afraid
assets?
I have to cut you off there. We're past our time. Mr. Gasparo, please, for 5.
Great, thank you. This is going to be a bit of a playback from last week, where we talk about the difference between operating spending and capital investment. And a capital investment is an investment in our country. And would you agree that when we are investing in infrastructure, it achieves several objectives? The first is it increases productivity. Second is it increases employment. Third, it dampens inflation. And fourth, it attracts private capital into our country. Would you agree that those 4 pillars are absolutely critical in a modern economy?
I would agree if it's done effectively, and yeah, I would agree with all those 4. I would say for myself, it's the analogy of you drop $100,000 on your house for a renovation. If you expand the footprint of your house and you have additional space, potentially you can resell it and get the $100,000 back. If you drop $100,000 in a luxury kitchen with a boutique pasta maker, potentially not going to get the money back. So, of course, the devil's in the details of what you're actually investing in. But otherwise, yeah, in theory, I don't think you're going to find an economist anywhere in the country, or a conventional economist anywhere in the country or around the world, who's going to disagree with you.
Yeah, and I'm using your definition of infrastructure, capital projects, bridges, roads, power, all the things that our country needs to ensure that we are successful moving forward. So, for example, your estimate is that we are going to spend $159 billion in infrastructure over the next 4 years, not accounting for the NATO 5% spending, as you rightly put out. Do you agree that, again, using your analogy between investing in your home and maybe paying off a credit card by borrowing money, etc., that there is a substantial difference between, again, operating spending and capital investment?
Yes.
Perfect. I just want to make sure we're back on the record on that, because there seems to be still some confusion, I think, from some members of the committee that spending a dollar is different than investing a dollar. My question is, do you think we're spending enough on infrastructure?
That's a really good policy question for which I do not have the mandate to answer it, sadly.
Okay, so do you, in your analysis, obviously you spend a great deal of time looking at our projections moving forward. Do you think that our focus on infrastructure and some of these investments can set us up for success over the next 5 years, or let's just say over the long term?
It needs to happen. The trick is going to be in the execution. So the mainstay of how the Canadian economy used to operate vis-a-vis our integration with the U.S. is gone. And so there is an obvious and pressing need to make additional investments so we can reorient our supply chains and have capacity in place to export to other countries. And also, I think, as the other member pointed out, provide supports. So if somebody loses their job in Hamilton and there are jobs available in Calgary and they need to be retrained and they need to move and their spouse needs to move and their kids need to go to a different school, that there are supports in place so that can happen as well. And if you're a business and you need to reorient your business plan, your small business with 25 or 30 employees, there's support to make sure that that can happen. So, yeah. But the question, again, comes back to the execution. And when you look at the numbers today, when you look at the numbers that we presented today, it should reinforce to everybody both the seriousness of the situation and the urgency to make good choices very quickly.
Right.
Yeah, so very quickly.
Afraid that's
What's
our
the
time.
timeline, though? Like a year,
we'll go to
5
Ms.
years,
Gaudreau,
10
please, for
years?
2.5.
Président. Mais c'est juste-
Thank you.
I think that's also a question for which government's in power, but, you know.
There are major decisions to be taken, and what we're seeing a flagrant lack of transparency. I'll come back to models. I did talk about Quebec's, but there's New Brunswick and I believe British Columbia. In the Maritimes, maybe Nova Scotia, which is setting up an operating and investment budget. How can that model or those models make it possible for us to have more transparency with what we're seeing? There are two aspects to transparency. First of all, there are types of investments that could give Canadians in Canada long-term benefits, and there's an advantage to clarity. And, as I believe I said last week, if the Government of Canada has a plan for managing the budget with an operating side and an investment side, there will be much more transparency in explaining that to parliamentarians. And all data can be presented. I imagine that in the choices the government will have to make, there will be specific calculations on revenue and expenditure, because otherwise the country can't make ends meet. We talk about risk management. We talk about positions being unsustainable. When I hear we're in trouble, do you think people are aware of the economic situation we're in at the moment and of what's coming? I believe yes. Now, I hope so. That is the primary responsibility of our organization: increase financial transparency for members of Parliament. And now it's up to you to explain it to Canadians in your riding. Thank you. Thank you for the work you're doing. And I hope we do have a very clear budget.
Go block to block.
Thank you very much, Chair. In Appendix C of your report, you have corporate income tax increasing year over year. In recent months, we have had reports of companies moving south of the border and billions of dollars of investment leaving Canada. Was that taken into account in your projections for the corporate income tax?
Thank you for your question. We did take into account recent information, specifically from the Fiscal Monitor for corporate income taxes, as well as in our projection, we've incorporated the nominal GDP decline, which is our broadest tax base, into our corporate profits projection. You do see a decline in 25-26 compared to the level to 24-25, but what we are still observing is high corporate income taxes coming through the fiscal monitor. So perhaps that information that you're referencing is not yet reflected in the fiscal monitor. But we have taken into account a decline through the nominal GDP, just to be clear.
Thank you. Are there any concerns that if the government continues on with its current policies, that businesses and investment will continue to leave Canada, leaving the government with less revenue overall?
The simple answer to that question is the status quo approach is not sustainable.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. Additionally, in your report, you mention a risk of prolonged trade uncertainty, bringing about even worse deficits. Does your report also take into consideration the flow of capital leaving Canada during a prolonged trade dispute and how it will affect the ability for our economy to recover?
Good question.
So that's actually one of our downside, I guess, biggest downside risk. And as Jason says, if the current situation, status quo, is not sustainable.
Okay, and I guess my last question for you would be, if the government continues on its current spending levels, when do you project the budget to be balanced?
That's what I wanted to know.
Is that a trick? Is that a trick question?
Yeah.
If you have
never. The answer is never.
Yeah. A very long time. Again, the current status quo is not sustainable. Before, the more immediate pressure for the government, again, looking at the economic forecast, is where we're going to be in years 3 and 4 and 5, and whether the investments that the government plans to make in the economy and capital and infrastructure and the supports they intend to provide to people to retrain and to move across new industries, whether those are effective and whether they're managed effectively. Yeah.
So under the previous Prime Minister, we were told that budgets would balance themselves. Does it concern you that under this current Prime Minister, we don't even talk about balancing budgets?
True. So true.
The bigger concern as the Interim Parliamentary Budget Officer, and given the mandate of our organization to promote fiscal transparency, the bigger concern for us is the current weakness or unevenness in fiscal transparency, because it leaves, notwithstanding our work, it definitely hinders the work of parliamentarians in doing theirs, because there are some very weighty policy decisions that are going to need to be made in a minority parliament over the coming months very quickly. And the more information that is provided to parliamentarians regarding the current fiscal context, all parliamentarians, the easier, like our organization, the easier it will be for anyone to make decisions. More information shared more widely and a higher quality puts everybody further ahead.
Thank you.
Sorry.
We thank you, Mr. Chair, and maybe two final questions, and I will just quote a few headlines. In fact, it was just a year ago that your predecessor, Monsieur Giroux, said that the federal government can spend $46 billion more a year and remain sustainable over the long term. And I think he used the year just about 2098. And he said every year until 2098 and remain fiscally sustainable. And so I was just wondering, in terms of maybe concluding comments, and I have one more headline after that, how does this discussion square with that comment from last year?
I worked on that report. I was responsible for it, and a lot has changed over 12 months.
So I guess it would be fair to say that a lot can change within a year.
Yes, and hopefully, hopefully over the next 12 months, all the current problems we have go away.
A positive
And we're back to where we
parliamentary
were before.
discussion can
I
lead to
hope
such
so.
changes. You're absolutely right. Thank you. I appreciate you very much saying that. I also wanted, on that note, really, I was delighted to read another headline that said that with our Prime Minister being in New York at the UN Assembly, they said that he's very popular. There's more than 700 requests that flooded in from foreign leaders, but many actually from CEOs and company representatives. And so as we talk about indicators of confidence in our country, does that in any way serve in any way as you evaluate the confidence that we have in our country?
Yeah, the business confidence is one of the key variables we consider as part of our macroeconomic model. And obviously the confidence that both external entrepreneurs and CEOs have, potentially more importantly, the confidence that individual Canadians have to step up and start a small business. Those who have a small business can take the next step, borrow additional money and make investments and hire people. That's a critical factor that we pay a lot of attention to in terms of economic growth.
Okay, thank you very much for those comments. That's all for me. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for all of you being here. I have one question, though. I was reading also a headline about a wonderful young man named Louis Jacques, who was running across the country to PEI to raise money for St. Joe's Table. Any relation?
Yeah, that would be my son, Mr. Chair. Yeah.
I had to put that on the record. Thanks for everyone being with us. Very quickly, witnesses for Canada Post's first tranche. Please have them in by October 7th. I suspect we can add later, but please, so we can get our clerk working on it. Recommendations for the Consul General report, if you could have them in by next Thursday. We're not here Tuesday, of course, but we're starting Consul General report Thursday. If you could have your recommendations into the analysts. They always can be revised, but it'd be nice if we have them in because quite often there's overlap so that we can build recommendations together. And the last point, the procurement ombudsman we were going to have in, he just put out the report. I'm sure everyone saw the draft report. It's not public yet, so we'll wait till it's actually tabled and made public before we can actually bring him in to brief us, but also go over that report. For those who weren't here last time, it was a report generally commissioned, lack of better words, by this committee.
I'm not sure if I'm allowed to make a point of order at this point.
What's your point of order?
Simply, for me, I find the best practice in all meetings is to be able to receive reports at least 24 hours ahead. I mean, if you look at all organizations, they have...
What report are you referring to?
So today's report from our parliamentary budget officer, I think, for me, I find receiving no notice. I was in meetings all day. I arrived at my desk and the report was there. And I find that that's unfair and not a proper meeting procedure to not be given sufficient notice.
Notice went out yesterday.
The report was only received today.
I know, but notice went out yesterday.
Yeah, but we need to read a report. Notice is one thing, but to be able to assess a report. Okay. So if you could, Mr. Chair, when it's possible, to provide, that would be great. Yes.
Take that under
I'm a busy MP. Thank you.
You all are. Everyone, again, Mr. Jacques and colleagues from the PBO, wonderful to have you with us. And with that, we are adjourned.
Okay. That's it for this. As you guys know, we won't be live tomorrow, Monday, Tuesday, so we'll see you guys Wednesday for live streams. I'll get clips out on the channel for sure over the weekend. I'm going to go ahead and get some stuff out if you missed question period. I'm going to go ahead and put that on the channel. And I usually do kind of catch up if there's CTV question period and other things like that happen over the weekend, or minister meetings, things like that. I try to catch clips like that too. So you can always take a look at the top of the channel, the playlist there, stay informed, and there'll be some stuff that sometimes always isn't in the live streams. But yeah, other than that, thanks everybody for tuning in. Thanks for watching. Hope everybody has a fantastic rest of your evening, a good weekend, and I will see you guys on Wednesday. Cheers, guys.